Hey guys, tonight we begin with feudal Japan, the land of geishas who somehow get misidentified every 5 minutes, and monks who definitely did more than meditate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the average person imagines a samurai, they picture a 6-foot-tall statue of discipline standing perfectly still under a cherry blossom tree while dramatic flute music plays in the background. The man never blinks, never sweats, never smiles. He simply breathes honor. If you believe the stereotype, he lives on poetry and principles alone, and the only thing he fears is dishonor and maybe a lukewarm bowl of tea. Sadly, history is here to ruin your aesthetic. Samurai were not Zen superheroes. They were armed men with tempers, allergies, debts, grudges, and a love-hate relationship with rice taxes. The famous Bushido Code, the Holy Handbook of Honor, was mostly written after the wars were already over, when samurai had nothing left to do except sit around the house, write moral guidelines, and pretend they'd always behaved that way. Imagine someone writing gym rules after everyone already left. That's Bushido. The real medieval samurai was a professional warrior in an era where professional meant did not die immediately. Some were incredibly loyal. Others betrayed their lords faster than you can say, better offer. Many switched sides mid-war like free agents during a very violent sports draft. One clan even changed allegiance in the middle of a battle because they felt like it. Honor? Not today. Thanks. And let's not pretend samurai were all calm and stoic. These men wrote dramatic poetry about their feelings, sulked when ignored, and sometimes committed murder because someone insulted their horse. If you think modern men are emotionally complex, try a samurai who just lost at poetry night. Movies teach us samurai protected the weak. Reality teaches us peasants prayed samurai didn't walk through their village. A samurai visit meant taxes, confiscated chickens, or some new rule like don't breathe too loudly near the estate. If a samurai ever protected a village from bandits, it's because he was already using that village for taxes and didn't want the competition. They weren't minimalist monks of discipline. They were stressed government employees who had to file reports, attend ceremonies, survive wars, memorize etiquette, manage land, and still look intimidating while covered in sweat and questionable decisions. The truth is beautifully simple. Samurai were human beings with swords. Dangerous? Yes. Honorable? Sometimes. Overhyped? Always. If the stereotype paints them as perfect warriors, the reality paints them as deeply flawed men trying to hold a collapsing country together while desperately hoping no one notices their armor. Smells like regret. If movies were accurate, ninjas would be supernatural shadow creatures capable of turning invisible, running across rooftops without making a sound, and murdering a room full of guards using only a decorative chopstick and pure spite. In pop culture, a ninja is basically a discount Batman with more smoke bombs and less emotional therapy. Reality, unfortunately, is here again, knocking, entering, and ruining the fantasy. A real ninja, or shinobi, if we're being historically correct, was not a magical assassin hopped up on mystic arts. He did not teleport. He did not somersault through the air like a caffeinated gymnast. And he definitely did not wear all-black stealth pajamas. That costume was invented by theatre performers, so audience members could easily recognize who was supposed to be invisible. Yes, ninjas are literally dressed like stagehands. Actual ninjas dressed like farmers, merchants, monks, delivery guys. Basically anything that wouldn't attract the attention of the local samurai who had a bad habit of stabbing first and questioning motives never. Ninjas were spies first, saboteurs second, and part-time arsonists when the mission required light interior redesign through fire. Their most important skills were not backflips and blade tricks. It was lying convincingly, blending in, and running away faster than any man wearing sandals should reasonably be able to. The ninja toolkit was surprisingly practical. Rope, check. Disguises, check. Poison, sometimes. Smoke bombs, absolutely. Not for dramatic disappearing, but for, oh no, everything's terrible, time to sprint into the forest at top speed. The stereotype of the silent rooftop assassin also falls apart once you realize Japanese rooftops were built out of wood and tiles designed specifically to betray your location, if so much as a squirrel coughed nearby. If a ninja ever tried to sprint across a roof like in the movies, everyone within 12 miles would know about it. The idea that samurai and ninjas were mortal enemies? Also nonsense. Most ninjas were hired by samurai. Ninja clans like Iga and Koga earned a living doing the dirty jobs samurai didn't want to admit they needed: spying, sabotage, and quietly removing problematic individuals who couldn't be removed publicly. A ninja wasn't a shadow demon. He was a blue-collar intelligence worker balancing espionage, improvisation, and cardiovascular fitness. He used cunning, stealth, and the ability to say, "Nope, I'm not dying for this mission," at the correct time. So yes, ninjas were dangerous. But not because they performed magical backflips, because they were sneaky, practical, and smart enough to run away before the sword swung. If samurai are the warrior heroes, and ninjas are the mysterious shadows, then the shogun is often imagined as the final boss of Japan, a godlike mastermind seated in a golden hall, stroking his immaculate beard as he controls the entire country with absolute calm. The stereotype paints him as a divine strategist who never breaks a sweat and definitely never worries about taxes, paperwork, or that one daimyo who keeps acting suspiciously loyal. Reality would like a word, and that word is stress. The shogun was essentially the CEO of chaos, responsible for managing hundreds of heavily armed landlords with the emotional stability of caffeinated squirrels. He wasn't some serene overlord dispensing wisdom from a mountaintop. He was a chronically tired military dictator trying desperately to keep the country from exploding again. Medieval Japan was basically a pressure cooker filled with swords, ambition, rice, and rage. People assume the emperor ruled Japan. No. The emperor was more like a spiritual mascot, loved, admired, and ceremonially important, but politically about as powerful as a decorative teapot. The shogun ran the show, which meant every problem: famine, rebellious monks, angry samurai, greedy merchants, lost paperwork, foreign ships on the horizon, landed directly on his already overworked desk. The shogun's daily life was a balancing act between diplomacy and please don't revolt today. Every daimyo claimed loyalty, but half of them were secretly plotting, and the other half were too busy mismanaging their rice to cause a rebellion even if they wanted to. The shogun had to keep them in line by forcing them to spend huge amounts of money traveling to Edo, hosting ceremonies, and maintaining 2 households, which was less about honor and more about "let me bankrupt you so you behave." Any peaceful era under the shogunate wasn't peace. It was the shogun holding the country together with political duct tape, bribes, military threats, and a constant fear that someone somewhere was sharpening a sword, just in case. Did shoguns have power? Absolutely. Did they enjoy it? Absolutely not. You try running a country where half your subordinates have katanas, the other half have grudges, and everyone thinks meditation is an acceptable substitute for therapy. In the end, the shogun wasn't a divine ruler. He was a man managing the world's most dangerous group project, and everyone else had a sword. If stereotypes were accurate, a geisha would be a soft-spoken seductress drifting through lantern-lit streets, whispering poetry into a samurai's ear while plucking a shamisen under the moonlight. In movies, she exists solely to look elegant, act mysterious, and break hearts for a living, like a human perfume advertisement with better hair. Reality would like to submit a politely furious correction. A geisha is not, and never was, a prostitute, not a courtesan, not a companion for hire, not a Japanese escort, not a samurai girlfriend, not even the Edo-era equivalent of that girl at the club who gives good eye contact. Geisha were, and still are, professional entertainers, highly trained in dance, music, social performance, conversation, etiquette, and emotional management. which, in a room full of samurai, was basically crisis negotiation. If samurai were the sword of Japan, geisha were the soundtrack, the ones who made the room feel expensive enough for everyone to pretend they weren't on the verge of political collapse. Training began young and was intense. A geisha in training, a maiko, wasn't learning flirtation. She was learning how to keep a wealthy daimyo's attention without encouraging any expectations he wasn't allowed to have. It was an art of balance. Charm without invitation, elegance without submission, presence without possession. Basically, I'm here to entertain you, not adopt you. Meanwhile, the stereotype confusion largely comes from Western visitors in the 19th century who, in true Western fashion, misunderstood absolutely everything. They saw women in elaborate kimono and thought, ah yes, clearly this is the sexy profession. These were the same visitors who thought chopsticks were small weapons, so accuracy was not their strong point. In reality, geisha were respected cultural figures. They weren't walking into tea houses to serve anyone except the atmosphere. They entertained with performance, conversation, and wit, something many samurai found more terrifying than an armed duel. Could a geisha fall in love? Yes, she was human, despite appearances suggesting otherwise. But that was personal, not professional. If a geisha accepted a romantic patron, it was negotiated, formal and slow. Less romance and more legal paperwork with feelings. So the stereotype of the seductive geisha exists because history got filtered through tourists who needed subtitles and had very active imaginations. The truth? Geisha were, and remain, artists. Disciplined, skilled, controlled, the living embodiment of grace under pressure. And absolutely none of that required taking their clothes off. If the geisha is the most misunderstood woman in Japan, the oiran is the reason why. Every time someone calls a geisha a prostitute, an oiran somewhere in the afterlife sighs loudly and says, "That was my job, respect the resume." Unlike geisha, who were entertainers, oiran were elite courtesans, emphasis on elite. These weren't your dimly lit back-alley stereotypes. Oiran were closer to celebrities who also happened to work in the pleasure industry. They were the luxury edition, the if you have to ask, you can't afford it version of intimacy in the Edo period. Let's start with the outfits, because the stereotype usually begins there. An oiran dressed like a fashion designer dared them to wear everything at once. Towering platform sandals? Check. An entire cherry tree worth of ornaments in the hair? Check. Kimono so layered and heavy that walking required the balance and muscle control of an Olympic figure skater? Absolutely check. An oiran did not simply walk. She executed a ritualized slow-motion strut called the oiran dochu, which looked like a fashion parade mixed with a hostage situation. Men watched in awe as she glided by, partly because she was stunning, and partly because they weren't sure how she was still upright under 60 pounds of silk. But here's where people get it wrong. Being an oiran was not just about physical beauty. They were educated in poetry, calligraphy, etiquette, witty conversation, playing instruments, and mastering the art of flattering rich men without becoming emotionally attached to any of them. Basically, they were influencers before influencers, except with actual talent. Clients didn't buy time with them. They competed for it. An oiran didn't say yes to everyone. She picked patrons carefully, like a queen choosing her advisors, except with more incense and slightly higher emotional stakes. And then there's the big confusion. Geisha. The two crossed paths in the entertainment districts, which is why history becomes messy. But socially, culturally, financially, spiritually, and functionally, the roles were not the same. The oiran's world revolved around intimacy and status. The geisha's world revolved around art and performance. One sold charm, one sold atmosphere. People still mix them up, proving that confusion has a very long shelf life. Oiran were glamorous, powerful, and trapped at the same time, admired by those who could afford them and pitied by those who couldn't. They were icons of beauty and tragedy, wrapped in silk and expectation. but at least their hair looked incredible while doing it. In movies, the Ronin is the ultimate lone wolf, a mysterious swordsman wandering dusty roads, seeking revenge, justice, and maybe a poetic sunset. He speaks rarely, fights flawlessly, and maintains a level of calm that suggests he bathes in cold waterfalls every morning while contemplating destiny. Reality? Try unemployed samurai with bills, trauma, no benefits, and no HR department. A Ronin was simply a samurai who lost his lord. Whether because the lord died, was overthrown, fired him, or, in some cases, because the samurai himself resigned. Translation: he ran away and hoped no one noticed. The word literally means wave man, as in someone drifting aimlessly through society, like a leaf on water, or that friend who keeps switching careers every 6 months. The stereotype of the Ronin as a noble, stoic warrior is mostly romantic fiction, written centuries later by authors who didn't have to deal with unemployment. Actual Ronin struggled the same way modern jobless men do: identity crisis, poverty, and questionable side gigs. Many Ronin became wandering teachers, hoping someone wanted lessons in swordsmanship, etiquette, or how to survive an ego collapse. Others tried farm work, failed spectacularly, and returned to the road with even more depression. Some became mercenaries, some became bodyguards, and others became bandits. Because if you give a starving man a sword and no paycheck, the moral compass tends to wobble. The famous 47 Ronin myth didn't help. People treat it like the gold standard of honor, forgetting that most Ronin weren't planning noble vendettas. They were trying to figure out how to pay for their next bowl of noodles. The 47 happened to be famous because they achieved revenge, became legends, and then executed themselves, setting an unrealistic success metric for the rest of Ronin everywhere. Life on the road wasn't cinematic. It was dirty, dangerous, and lonely. Ronin couldn't simply knock on a daimyo's door and ask for work, especially when daimyo were already drowning in samurai with questionable loyalty. Many cities even banned Ronin from entering because heavily armed, emotionally unstable men turned out to be a public safety concern. And despite the cool stereotype, Ronin did not spend all day dueling. Most duels ended with someone injured, dead, or both, so the average Ronin preferred not to gamble his life on a sword fight unless absolutely necessary, or unless he was already at rock bottom, in which case death by dramatic duel was probably on the bucket list. The truth: Ronin were not mystical warriors. They were jobless samurai trying to survive feudal Japan's gig economy with a sword, a bad attitude, and whatever dignity they had left. If movies were to be believed, Ashigaru were the nameless, faceless soldiers whose only job was to run forward, scream loudly, and die immediately so the samurai hero can look dramatic standing alone. They're portrayed as disposable cardboard cutouts in poorly fitted armour, essentially the medieval Japanese version of NPC with one line. Reality, as usual, is far less flattering and far more heroic. The Ashigaru were foot soldiers, peasant-born, poorly paid, and expected to fight battles using whatever weapon their lord had lying around that month. Sometimes spears, sometimes bows. Occasionally, if morale was low, a very sharp gardening tool. These were not men raised on poetry and honour. These were men raised on rice shortages, back pain, and the crushing weight of knowing their armour was worth more than their lives. The stereotype paints them as incompetent. But Ashigaru were the backbone of Japanese warfare. Without them, no samurai army would last longer than it takes to mispronounce konnichiwa. They served as the infantry, the archers, the first attackers, the last defenders, the labourers, the ones who cleaned up the mess after the samurai finished posing dramatically. In short, everything. And let's talk about disposable. Ashigaru were disposable in the same way your spine is disposable. You technically can live without it, but you're not going to win any battles. Their training varied wildly. Some lords drilled their Ashigaru relentlessly, producing disciplined foot soldiers. Other lords simply handed peasants spears and said, "Stand there and try not to die too fast." Either way, Ashigaru knew that any battle could end in glory, or limbs, or both. People imagine a shigeru as weak or unskilled because they weren't wearing lacquered armor or waving polished katanas. But these men marched miles a day, carried heavy gear, endured freezing winters, slept in mud, and fought brutal close-range combat with the physical stamina of people who had never heard of rest days. And the samurai. They relied on a shigeru more than they'd ever admit. Samurai armies needed a shigeru to hold the line, absorb the arrows, swarm the enemy, and secure victory while the elite warriors worried about honor, lineage, and whether their helmet crest was big enough. Ashigaru weren't fancy. They weren't glamorous. They weren't protagonists in anyone's epic poem. They were overworked, underpaid, and constantly one order away from running headfirst into danger, just so someone with a prettier helmet could take credit for the victory. The truth is simple. Samurai won battles. Ashigaru made them winnable. In modern portrayals, the daimyo is a menacing figure, a shadowy warlord brooding in a candlelit castle, petting a hawk, laughing with villainous elegance, and plotting schemes worthy of a drama series. He's usually surrounded by trembling servants, disloyal advisors, and one strategically placed koi pond that symbolizes his emotional depth. Reality was significantly less cinematic and significantly more property management. A daimyo was essentially a landlord with weapons, managing a domain full of peasants, samurai, taxes, irrigation drama, harvest failures, and at least one incompetent cousin trying to overthrow him every spring. He wasn't plotting world domination. He was trying to keep the rice surplus above everyone riot's level. That was the true battlefield. Yes, daimyo commanded armies, but they also commanded budgets, construction projects, and a list of angry samurai expecting raises. A daimyo's day started with reports, ended with reports, and occasionally featured a rebellion, fire, assassination attempt, collapsed bridge, or famine in between. If daimyo looks stoic in artwork, it's because the artist couldn't paint existential crisis into a face. Our stereotype paints daimyo as brilliant strategists. Many were. Others made decisions that could only be described as creative disasters. Some spent fortunes on castle beautification while ignoring military preparedness. Some wasted resources on massively oversized helmet decorations, and at least one daimyo thought it was a good idea to fight the shogun using only enthusiasm and poorly written poetry. Spoiler, it was not. Then there was the Sankin Kotai system, also known as the shogun's annual Make the Daimyo Broke tour. Daimyo had to maintain two households, one in their domain and one in Edo, and parade across the country with enormous entourages to show loyalty. It was part political theatre, part devastating financial punishment, and part cardio. Imagine walking 100 miles with thousands of retainers just so the shogun can say, "Nice effort, try not to rebel this year." Daimyo also juggled clan politics, arranged marriages, succession crises, border disputes, temple-related complaints, and merchants who were secretly richer than they were. At any given moment, a daimyo was 5 bad harvests away from becoming a ronin with nicer robes. So no, daimyo were not anime villains reigning from thrones of absolute power. They were exhausted administrators trying to prevent their clan, their land, and their sanity from collapsing at the same time. If samurai fought battles, daimyo fought bureaucracy. And honestly, the bureaucracy was worse. When most people picture a Japanese monk, they imagine a bald, serene figure meditating under a waterfall, whispering profound wisdom to passing travellers and gently encouraging inner peace. They float through popular imagination like walking fortune cookies, speaking in haiku and never raising their voice above a soft breeze. History, meanwhile, is rolling on the floor, laughing. Let's be clear. Some monks really did meditate. Some truly sought enlightenment. Some lived quiet, disciplined lives of prayer and study. But many monks, especially in medieval Japan, were something closer to lightly armed landlords with spiritual branding. These were the Sohei, the warrior monks. Monks who, for reasons no modern HR department would approve of, had access to weapons, armor, private armies, and absolutely zero chill. If you think monk means peaceful, try picturing 1,000 of them marching down a mountain with naginata, chanting sutras, and preparing to settle a theological disagreement using fire and sharp metal. The stereotype of peaceful monks evaporates when you realize entire temples functioned as feudal power centers. Temples owned land, collected taxes, stored wealth, and competed for influence like monasteries on caffeine. The divide between spiritual guidance and military occupation was often as thin as a parchment scroll. When a temple wanted political leverage, they didn't send diplomats. They sent monks marching into the capital carrying sacred symbols as protest. Symbols which, for reasons unclear but spectacular, frequently burst into riots. The court respected these actions not out of reverence, but because the monks were armed, organized, and extremely comfortable with property damage. And yes, rival temples fought each other. Not metaphorically, literally. With fire, siege warfare, and an enthusiasm that suggested enlightenment could, in fact, be achieved through arson. Even the more peaceful sects weren't always peaceful. A monk might spend the morning copying sutras and the afternoon beating a bandit who wandered too close. Another might lecture on compassion, but then charge battlefield fees for blessings. Spirituality cost money, and temples had payroll. But for all the chaos, monks were essential cultural forces. They preserved knowledge, influenced politics, educated elites, and shaped Japanese philosophy. They were scholars, diplomats, healers, and sometimes, unfortunately, pyromaniacs. So no, monks weren't all gentle sages floating above worldly concerns. They were complex, powerful, dramatic, and occasionally terrifying participants in Japan's feudal mess. In short, some monks sought enlightenment, some sought peace, some sought battle, and some sought to win all three. The stereotype of the Japanese farmer is almost offensively gentle. A humble peasant greeting the sunrise with gratitude, planting rice in tranquil silence, smiling warmly at the earth like a man who definitely sleeps 8 hours and has never once been threatened by a samurai with tax anxiety. In movies, farmers exist to provide background ambience, moral lessons, and an occasional tearful speech about the simple life. Reality would like to issue a rice-flavoured complaint. Being a farmer in feudal Japan meant living a life so difficult that modern people would file lawsuits just reading about it. These were not peaceful Zen gardeners. These were endurance athletes trapped inside a never-ending agricultural horror show. From dawn until the next dawn, farmers worked, planting, harvesting, repairing tools, repairing themselves, and praying the weather didn't ruin everything again. And let's talk about taxes, because samurai certainly did. Farmers were taxed in rice. Not money, not favours, rice, meaning their livelihood was literally taken away the moment it appeared. Samurai would roll into the village demanding their share, which usually translated to, all the rice we want, and also whatever you were hoping to eat this winter. If farmers looked calm in artwork, it's because the artist didn't have enough ink to draw their emotional turmoil. The stereotype says farmers were respected as the backbone of society. Reality says they were respected the same way a horse is respected, essential, hard-working, and constantly overburdened. Every year, farmers gambled their entire existence on forces outside their control. Floods, droughts, insects, typhoons, rice blight, bandits, taxation, fire, war, more war, and occasionally, samurai operating with the grace of a wrecking ball. A single bad harvest meant starvation. A single political shift meant higher taxes. A single samurai patrol meant hiding anything edible so it didn't mysteriously vanish. And yet, farmers somehow kept the entire system running. They built irrigation systems, rotated crops, maintained villages, raised families, hosted festivals they couldn't afford, and still managed to show up to battle when their lord needed militia support. They did everything except rest. In fact, if a medieval Japanese farmer had ever experienced a moment of true peace, he probably would have assumed he was dead. So, no. Farmers weren't serene villagers living harmonious spiritual lives. They were exhausted, resilient, unrecognized heroes of feudal Japan, carrying the entire country on their backs while everyone else argued about honor. The only simple thing about their life was the fact that it was simply too hard. If you believe the stereotype, Japan's feudal merchants were sleazy deal-makers lurking in alleys, rubbing their hands together and whispering, "What's it worth to you?" like medieval used car salesmen. In movies, they're portrayed as greedy, cunning, and socially inferior, the kind of people samurai wouldn't touch unless taxes were due, or someone needed to be blamed for inflation. Reality, however, loves irony, and merchants were irony incarnate. Officially, merchants ranked at the bottom of Japan's social hierarchy, beneath samurai, farmers, and artisans. The logic was, farmers grow food, artisans create tools, samurai make laws, and merchants simply move goods around like glorified delivery men. Therefore, merchants were unproductive. But while the samurai were writing poetry about honor and farmers were dying from overwork, merchants were quietly inventing capitalism. By the Edo period, merchants had money, serious money. They ran trade networks, controlled credit, financed construction projects, produced clothing trends, owned entertainment districts, funded theatrical productions, bribed officials, and indirectly shaped national taste. They were basically medieval bankers with better kimono. The stereotype of the greedy merchant mostly came from samurai who were jealous. Samurai earned fixed stipends in rice, stipends that did not keep up with the cost of living, while merchants swam in cash flow and interest rates. Samurai had honor. Merchants had money. Guess which one actually paid rent? Merchants had to pretend to be humble because showing wealth could get them in trouble. So they mastered the art of quiet flexing. No flashy estates, just modest houses with luxurious interiors hidden from public view. No ostentatious jewellery, but entire warehouses of silk, sake and art, stored for business purposes. No political power, except the kind you get from loaning money to the politicians. And while samurai liked to sneer at merchants, they also liked borrowing from them. Frequently, desperately, sometimes aggressively. More than one samurai household survived only because some low-class merchant extended credit out of pity or opportunism. Merchants also shaped culture. They popularized kabuki, created new fashion styles, and funded entire entertainment districts like the Yoshiwara. Because if you control nightlife, you basically control society. So yes, merchants were clever. Yes, they were wealthy. But greedy? Only in the sense that they enjoyed eating food and not starving. The truth is simple. Samurai had power on paper. Merchants had power in practice, and everyone knew it. Especially the merchants. The stereotype of the Japanese swordmaster is practically a spiritual event. He appears in every movie as a mysterious ancient man with perfect posture, a whisper-quiet voice, and eyebrows that convey 600 years of tragedy. He slices falling leaves mid-air, defeats 12 attackers without blinking, and speaks exclusively in haiku that sound like rejected fortune cookie lines. Reality, however, offers a slightly different portrait. A tired, underpaid instructor trying to teach swordsmanship to teenagers who would rather be anywhere else. Let's begin with the obvious myth. The idea that swordmasters could slice through stone pillars, iron armour, or, on especially dramatic days, the viewer's suspension of disbelief. Actual swordmasters didn't perform supernatural feats. If a student asked them how to cut through steel, the master would likely reply, "With another piece of steel, idiot," before sending them to sweep the floor again. Swordmasters ran dojos, which were less mystical sanctuaries, and more like martial arts schools, with constant noise, questionable smells, and students who swung wooden swords like they were trying to swat flies. Most of a master's day consisted of correcting bad footwork, preventing students from injuring each other, and explaining for the 10th time why screaming louder does not make the sword sharper. The stereotype imagines sword masters spending their days training heroes. Reality says they spent their days training whoever paid the fee. Farmers, low-rank samurai, merchants' kids, bored adolescents, aspiring troublemakers. Anyone with a few coins could join. Sword mastery, it turns out, is less about destiny and more about tuition. Were some sword masters legendary? Absolutely. Men like Miyamoto Musashi earned reputations by winning duels and writing philosophical texts. But even Musashi didn't go around slicing boulders. He spent half his life teaching, wandering, avoiding responsibilities, and occasionally smacking disciples with wooden swords to build character. Swordmasters also had politics. Rival schools would challenge each other, sabotage each other, and occasionally brawl in the streets because someone claimed their footwork style was superior. Imagine martial artists arguing online, but with real swords and a higher chance of someone losing a limb. And the wisdom? Yes, swordmasters had it, but it wasn't all magic phrases. Sometimes the advice was simply, stop fighting like an angry chicken. In the end, swordmasters were not mystical warriors living atop mountains. They were skilled professionals navigating egos, injuries, finances, dojo drama, and students with the reflexes of sleepy turtles. The myth is beautiful. The reality is educational. And neither involves cutting through a boulder. The stereotype of the female samurai, or honor bugeisha, is pure cinematic gold. A deadly warrior woman slicing through armies while wearing flawless eyeliner, her hair flowing behind her like a shampoo commercial sponsored by sword violence. Modern portrayals make her look like a one-woman army, casually embarrassing entire clans while delivering feminist monologues in perfect slow motion. Reality nods politely, then sighs deeply. Yes, women warriors did exist in Japan. No, they were not running around like unstoppable anime heroines, defeating 50 men before breakfast. And definitely no, they did not fight in glamorous armor designed to show off their cheekbones. Most honor bugeisha were upper-class women trained to defend their households when their husbands, fathers, and every male relative had the bright idea to leave home for battle and take the entire village defense force with them. Female warriors often fought because the alternative was A. Die, B. Let their home be burned down, C. Both in that order. Movies tend to focus on the naginata, the long polearm traditionally associated with women. The stereotype. It was given to women because it's elegant and graceful. Reality. It allowed women to stab invaders from a safe and respectable distance. Nothing says equality like someone breaking into your house and you greeting him with a 6-foot blade. Were there legendary female warriors? Absolutely. Tomoe Gozen, the Beyoncé of medieval Japan, fought in the Genpei War and was described as strong, beautiful, and terrifying, which is basically the holy trinity of compliments. Nakano Takeko led women into battle during the Boshin War and proved that "don't mess with me" is a timeless concept. But these women were exceptions, not the norm. Hollywood would have you believe Japan had entire armies of female samurai sprinting into battle like an ancient feminist flash mob. In truth, most women who fought did so during emergencies, sieges, rebellions, last stands, and domestic "oh no, the samurai are coming through the gate" moments. When peace finally settled in the Edo period, women's martial training shifted from survival necessity to cultural tradition. The naginata became the proper weapon for moral virtue, physical discipline, and showing your neighbours you were absolutely capable of ending an argument permanently. So no, female samurai were not fantasy warriors in swirling silk robes. They were trained, tough, resourceful women who defended their homes, families, and dignity because someone had to. And the men were all busy yelling about honour several miles away. In short, not myth, not mascot, not mascara model warriors, just very real women doing very real violence when absolutely necessary. Modern pop culture loves the idea of the Yakuza, sharp suits, full-body tattoos, samurai-level discipline, and a moral code stricter than most people's gym routines. They're portrayed as noble criminals, honourable outlaws, the misunderstood bad boys of Japan's underworld. Reality in the Edo period? Try petty criminals with gambling addictions and questionable hygiene. Before the modern Yakuza existed, Japan had two main criminal groups: Takiya, peddlers, and Bakuto, gamblers. If you combine them, squint a little, and add 300 years of romanticizing, you get the Yakuza prototype. But in their original form, these men were about as glamorous as someone yelling at a stray dog behind a sake shop. Let's start with the takiya, the so-called travelling merchants. Sounds noble, right? No. Takiya sold cheap goods at festivals, markets and roadsides, half the time legally, the other half don't ask questions. They organised territories, collected protection money, occasionally hired muscle, and definitely did not read ancient codes of honour before overcharging farmers for wooden toys. Then there were the bakuto, the gamblers. These men lived in roadside huts, ran makeshift casinos, and preyed on bored or drunk travellers. They used dice, cards, and clever math to ensure that random chance always mysteriously favoured the house. If someone won too much, the bakuto suddenly needed to speak privately with him outside, where the odds of survival dropped dramatically. These criminals were not suave anti-heroes. Many were desperate men at the bottom of society, drifting between poverty, violence, and whatever shady job kept the sake flowing. Their tattoos, now iconic, originally marked them as criminals, not fashion icons. Back then, full-body ink was less artistic expression and more, "Please do not hire me. I'm committed to bad decisions." They also weren't respected. Samurai despised them. Merchants tolerated them. Villagers feared them. Even other bakuto didn't trust bakuto, which is impressive, considering they shared the same profession. The stereotypical honourable gangster didn't exist yet. There was no oath of loyalty, no rigid hierarchy, no dramatic sword duels in the rain. Early underworld types mostly fought with knives, fists, and whatever object they could grab before security arrived. But here's the funny part. Despite being chaotic, dangerous, and frequently broke, these early gangs laid the foundation for the modern Yakuza structure. The hierarchy, the rituals, the territory system. Over time, their reputation grew, their myth expanded, their style evolved. But in the Edo period, they were just criminals with better branding than bandits. No neon lights, no code of honor, no loyalty, just dice, debt, and desperation. If there's one stereotype more persistent than samurai honor or ninja magic, it's the idea that all of feudal Japan was peaceful, elegant, minimalist perfection. A land where everyone practiced Zen, gardens raked themselves, tea ceremony cured stress, and no one ever raised their voice except to compliment cherry blossoms. According to modern imagination, medieval Japan was basically a 600-year wellness retreat. Reality bursts through the sliding paper doors like a sweaty tax collector. Let's start with the aesthetic myth. Yes, Japan produced breathtaking art, refined tea ceremonies, delicate poetry, and architecture that still inspires designers today. But that's the highlight reel, not the daily reality. For every Zen garden, there were 50 muddy villages, 3 burning storehouses, and 1 castle undergoing repairs for the 5th decade in a row, because the daimyo kept spending the budget on helmet decorations instead of construction materials. People imagined clean streets, polite citizens, and perfect order. Actual medieval Japanese cities were crowded, flammable, loud, smelly, and about as perfectly ordered as a bag of startled raccoons. Fires happened so often that some neighbourhoods basically treated them as seasonal events, like cherry blossoms but more destructive. Then there's the idea of national harmony. Supposedly everyone respected strict social roles, honoured tradition, and obeyed authority. In reality, feudal Japan looked like someone tried to organise society using origami and duct tape. Samurai fought samurai. Monks fought monks. Daimyo rebelled against the shogun. Peasants rebelled against taxes. Merchants manipulated the economy. And every few decades, someone declared war because they woke up feeling ambitious. The stereotype also claims that everyone lived simple, humble, spiritual lives. This is adorable and wrong. Peasants struggled to survive. Samurai struggled to stay paid. Daimyo struggled to stay alive. Monks struggled not to burn down rival temples. Merchants struggled to hide their wealth from jealous samurai, Ninjas struggled to not get caught doing things they absolutely were not supposed to be doing. Even nature refused to cooperate. Japan dealt with earthquakes, floods, typhoons, tsunamis, landslides, volcanic eruptions, and the occasional famine just to keep things interesting. Anyone who thinks medieval Japan was peaceful clearly hasn't seen a village trying to harvest rice during monsoon season. And yet, this chaotic, muddy, fire-prone, politically unstable world produced extraordinary culture, philosophy, and beauty. But that beauty wasn't constant. It was carved out of hardship, refined through struggle, preserved by people who didn't have time for the nonsense stereotypes created centuries later. So no, feudal Japan wasn't a calm, noble paradise. It was messy, it was brutal, it was stunning, it was human. And honestly, that makes it better than the myth. You wake before the sun, but not because you're disciplined or spiritually enlightened. No. Medieval Paris simply refuses to let anyone sleep past daybreak. The city wakes you the way a marching band wakes a drunk nobleman. Loudly, unapologetically, and with every intention of ruining whatever dream you were having. Before the bells of Notre Dame even begin their melodic duties, the streets are already alive with the clatter of carts, the snorting of horses, and vendors warming up their voices like they're preparing for an opera titled "Buy My Vegetables or Else." You step into the alleyway, and immediately the city swallows you. The houses lean inward at angles that defy both physics and good taste, forming walls of timber and plaster so close that you could pass a loaf of bread to the person across the street without even stretching. Of course you wouldn't, not because you're selfish, but because there's always a non-zero chance they're about to dump a chamber pot from the window. In Paris, looking up is an extreme sport. Then the smells hit you, a cocktail blended without mercy. Fresh bread drifting from the baker's oven, smoke rolling out from charcoal braziers, frying onions sizzling somewhere 2 streets away. And beneath it all, the city's signature fragrance, sewage trickling through the central gutter like a tiny determined river that knows its purpose in life. Somehow these competing aromas fuse into a scent that can only be described as Paris Medieval Edition. Students from the University of Paris shuffle past in wrinkled robes, quoting Aristotle like gossip. They carry books they can't afford, argue in Latin no one asked to hear, and walk with the self-assured misery of people who haven't slept in 3 nights. Beggars already claim their usual corners, bowls ready, eyes sharp. They know the morning rush is prime time. Guilt is freshest before breakfast. The shopkeepers prepare for battle. The butcher sharpens his cleaver with a sound that screams confidence. The fishmonger arranges his catch, insisting it's fresh while avoiding eye contact. The spice seller builds tiny pyramids of saffron and pepper, each more precious than gold. And the noise. Paris never whispers. Metal clinks, hooves echo, dogs bark. Children sprint without permission or direction. The entire city announces itself before the sun even tries. This is dawn in medieval Paris. Loud, crowded, and absolutely impossible to forget. If dawn wakes Paris, the marketplace, Les Halles, is what kicks it fully into motion. By the time you arrive, the place is already overflowing with more people than should logically fit into the square. It's less a market and more a medieval battlefield where everyone is armed with baskets, elbows, and unreasonable confidence. If you hesitated for even 2 seconds, congratulations. A grandmother has already outpaced you, stolen your spot, and judged your footwear. Stalls stretch endlessly in a maze of cloth canopies and wooden tables, each one shouting its identity at you. The produce sellers arrange their goods in precarious pyramids that defy gravity. Apples, onions, cabbages in piles tall enough to qualify as architectural structures. The vegetable women, famous for their lung power, scream deals louder than church bells. They don't offer prices. They attack you with them. The butcher's corner is another dimension entirely. Carcasses dangle from hooks like medieval Christmas ornaments, blood staining the wooden boards beneath. The butchers themselves look carved from the same material as their cleavers, big, loud, and slightly terrifying in that I once fought a boar with my bare hands way. If you buy meat from them, you're not just getting dinner, you're getting a performance. The fishmongers hold their ground against the unmistakable smell of river-borne regret. Fish laid out on beds of straw glisten with the hopeful shine of creatures that wish they were fresher. The sellers claim they pulled them from the Seine this morning, which is technically true, just not the part of the morning you'd prefer. Then come the spice merchants, the sensory royalty of Les Halles. Their stalls burst with colour, bright saffron, deep cinnamon, crushed pepper so expensive it might as well be currency. They whisper prices instead of yelling, not out of politeness, but because spices cost too much to risk attracting thieves or curious children who sneeze uncontrollably. Weavers, woodworkers, basket makers and tinkers complete the ensemble. They hawk everything from sturdy boots to pots that rattle suspiciously. Students wander through with empty purses and hopeful eyes. Beggars track them like wolves sensing weakness. The soundscape is pure chaos. Bargaining, laughing, swearing, clattering metal, dogs fighting over a bone, merchants arguing about whose goods are freshest or whose morals are worst. This is the marketplace of medieval Paris, loud, sprawling, unpredictable, and the city's beating, beautiful mess of a heart. If the marketplace is the heart of Paris, then its streets are the city's bloodstream. Vast, unpredictable, and occasionally clogged with trouble. The moment you leave Les Halles and wander deeper into the urban maze, you meet the true masters of the streets, the beggars, the hustlers, and the self-appointed entrepreneurs whose business model involves taking your money without paperwork. Beggars occupy every strategic point like seasoned military commanders. They know exactly which corners yield the most coins, which church doors attract the soft-hearted, and which taverns produce drunk nobles willing to donate out of guilt or impaired judgment. Some beggars tap into drama, fake limps, impressive sighs, and monologues worthy of a Parisian theatre. Others rely on volume. If you don't give them a coin, they'll politely remind you, loudly, repeatedly, and with the persistence of a medieval alarm clock. Then there are the children, orphans mostly. They operate in packs, fast and clever, darting under elbows and through crowds like tiny, determined foxes. They'll snatch a loaf of bread from a distracted baker or lift a coin pouch from a belt before you even feel the weight shift. If you catch one, congratulations. The rest of the pack has already stolen something else while you were celebrating. Not everyone on the street is desperate, though. Some are just shady. Nightmen, for example, take away the city's waste and have the audacity to charge for it. They walk with the swagger of men who know no one wants their job, but everyone needs them. Carriers, porters, and day labourers crowd street corners waiting for work, forming small clusters of men who look like they could build a cathedral before lunch if someone paid them enough. Then you meet the gangs, loose groups of rowdy young men who swagger through the streets claiming informal territory. They aren't quite criminals, but they also aren't winning any morality awards. Mostly they drink, shout insults at university students, and occasionally start brawls for entertainment. Their presence adds flavour to the city, the kind that makes you walk faster. And lingering behind it all is the persistent tension that anything at any time can turn into chaos. A cart accident, a spilled basket, a misunderstanding over who insulted whose goat. Paris lives on the brink of delightful disorder. In these streets, survival isn't about strength, it's about awareness. Pay attention, walk with confidence, and keep your pouch tied tight. Walk toward the left bank, and the atmosphere shifts. The smells get slightly less aggressive, the shouts become more articulate, and suddenly Latin is being thrown around like confetti at a royal wedding. This is the University of Paris, the intellectual furnace of medieval Europe, and the unofficial capital of loud academic arguments. Students swarm everywhere, wearing long robes that give them the appearance of wizard apprentices who failed out of magic school and chose philosophy instead. They come from England, Italy, Germany, Spain, and they all act like Paris belongs to them. These young men live, breathe, and eat arrogance. They debate in the streets, in taverns, on bridges, over food, under archways. anywhere with space and unwilling bystanders. Their favourite hobby? Arguing loudly about theology at times of day when normal people are trying to sleep. Their second favourite hobby? Starting fights with local Parisians when their theology arguments fail to impress. The locals call them Goliards, reckless, poetry writing, wine-gulping academic hooligans. Lectures take place in cramped rooms that smell like candle wax, chalk dust, and ambition. Professors read from massive books chained to desks, while students furiously take notes on wax tablets, trying to capture every word as if Aristotle himself were speaking. A single lecture could last hours. Missing one is a tragedy. Attending one is only slightly less tragic. Dormitory life is its own adventure. Students crowd into rented rooms above taverns, bakeries, and questionable businesses. Privacy is a myth. Hygiene is optional. Complaining is constant. If you walk near these student lodgings, you'll hear loud debates, louder laughter, and the occasional sound of someone vomiting out of a window after drinking more wine than wisdom. Despite all this chaos, the university is a magnet for dreamers. Knowledge is power, and in a world where most people can't read, the students are climbing toward a future that promises status, influence, and possibly a job that doesn't involve carrying buckets or gutting fish. But education doesn't come without tension. Students often clash with city authorities over curfews, taxes, and the small matter of behaving like civilized adults. The university defends them fiercely, insisting on academic rights and privileges, which sometimes leads to full-scale confrontations known as town and gown riots, essentially medieval versions of campus protests, but with more swords. Here in Paris, scholarship and chaos walk hand in hand. And somehow, it works. As the morning stretches toward midday, the working world of medieval Paris steps fully into motion. Craftsmen fill the streets like the gears of a massive, noisy human machine. If you follow the clang of metal, you'll find the blacksmiths. Shirt sleeves rolled up, faces streaked with soot, hammering iron with the kind of enthusiasm that suggests they're releasing all their emotions through the anvil. Sparks fly, customers shout over the noise, and apprentices scramble around fetching tools before their masters lose patience and start throwing things. Just down the street, the cobblers work in cramped shops that smell like leather, glue, and long hours. Shoes line the walls in neat rows, though most Parisians can't afford anything fancy. Still, cobblers remain busy because medieval shoes wear out faster than morale during a long sermon. The bakers work earlier than anyone, but by noon their shops have become temples of temptation. Loaves of warm bread sit stacked in baskets like edible trophies. The air is thick with the smell of yeast and flour, which is why customers crowd around the door even before opening hour. Bakers, being the celebrities they are, must deal with constant complaints about prices, crust thickness, and why yesterday's batch tasted spiritually inferior. Then there are the weavers. Their shops are filled with spindles, looms, and the rhythmic clatter of wood and thread. Weavers work with a zen-like focus, partly for artistry, partly because one wrong move can ruin a week's worth of labour and lead to a loud public meltdown. Every trade belongs to a guild, and guilds run Paris with the organisational precision of a medieval mafia, except with better paperwork. They set prices, regulate apprenticeships, inspect shops, and occasionally engage in friendly rivalries that escalate into not-so-friendly tavern brawls. Being guildless is social suicide. Being in a guild is both protection and obligation. They decide what you sell, how you sell it, and how many apprentices you can yell at per day. Carpenters, coopers, stonemasons, chandlers, rope makers. All of Paris hums with their labour. Streets become workshops, alleys become storage spaces, and the sound of work fills the air. Hammering, scraping, sawing, shouting, and the occasional, "Who took my tools?" The crafts of Paris maintain the city's pulse. Every object, every shoe, tool, candle, barrel, cloak, bowl, and beam comes from hands hardened by years of training. Here, work isn't just survival. It's identity. It shapes the city as surely as stone shapes a cathedral. When the sun begins to slide behind the rooftops of Paris, the city doesn't grow quiet. It simply changes costume. The working noise fades, replaced by the distinct rowdy heartbeat of taverns and alehouses lighting up for the night. If the daytime streets belong to merchants and craftsmen, the night belongs to drinkers, gamblers, gossipers, and people who really should be home but have decided to ruin tomorrow instead. Taverns spill music and arguments into the alleys. You can hear them before you see them. Laughter that borders on screaming, mugs slamming onto wooden tables, and the universal medieval sound of someone insisting they're not drunk while proving the opposite in real time. Candles flicker in smoky rooms packed with bodies, students, sailors, craftsmen, travellers, and the occasional nobleman slumming it while hoping no one recognises him. The ale flows cheaply, the wine flows sceptically, and the food is always a gamble. A stew could be magical or mildly threatening. Bread might be warm and fresh, or used previously as a weapon. But no one comes for culinary excellence. They come for the atmosphere, chaotic, crowded, and buzzing like a hive. Tavern keepers act as kings of their tiny realms. They decide who gets served first, who gets kicked out, and which arguments require intervention. Their assistants move impossibly fast, weaving between tables with mugs bigger than their arms, dodging grasping hands and slurred compliments with professional skill. If someone starts singing, half the room joins in. If someone starts a fight, the other half joins in. Gamblers gather in corners, rolling dice with an intensity usually reserved for religious pilgrimages. Coins clink, threats fly. Someone always claims the dice are cursed. Someone else threatens to bless them with a brick. You watch from a distance, pretending you're too wise to join, even though you're itching to try your luck. Outside the taverns, alehouses offer a slightly quieter but equally questionable experience. Here, drinkers gather around barrels, talking politics they barely understand, criticising the king they'll never meet, and bragging about accomplishments that almost certainly never happened. And above it all is Paris itself. Glowing windows, echoing laughter, distant bells, and the unmistakable hum of a city that refuses to sleep politely. Night in medieval Paris isn't peaceful or refined. It's loud, messy, unpredictable, and completely alive. If you thought medieval Paris was charming, that's because you haven't spent enough time thinking about its hygiene, or rather, its heroic lack thereof. By day, the city feels crowded and noisy. By evening, it becomes abundantly clear that Paris has declared a full-scale war on cleanliness, and is winning. The streets operate on a simple rule. Everything goes downhill. Literally. The central gutter, a shallow, grimy trench running through the middle of most streets, carries away whatever the city throws at it. Water, mud, stray vegetables, animal droppings, mysterious liquids of questionable origin, and the ever-famous contents of chamber pots. When someone yells, "Garde à l'eau," it is not a philosophical warning. It means move now, or become part of the city's drainage system. The smell is a character of its own, bold, confident, unashamed. Smoke from thousands of hearths mixes with sewage, fish guts from markets, tallow from candle makers, and whatever spices the nearest kitchen is burning in a valiant attempt to mask everything else. It's an aroma that lingers in your clothes, your hair, your soul. Visitors describe it delicately as distinct. Locals describe it as Tuesday. Waste management is handled by the nightmen, fearless individuals who collect human waste and haul it outside the city walls. They move through the streets in the dark, pushing carts of doom and wearing expressions that say, "I dare you to complain." They perform a necessary service, but society respects them the same way people respect thunderstorms, from a distance and with gratitude mixed with fear. Animals add their contributions as well. Pigs roam freely, snacking on whatever the gutter presents. Dogs wander the streets looking vaguely offended by everything. Horses leave behind souvenirs that are quickly crushed into the cobblestones by the morning rush. Bathing is theoretically encouraged by the church, but practically discouraged by the weather, the cost, and the general medieval belief that warm water might kill you. Public bathhouses exist, but their reputation ranges from social gathering place to questionable moral hazard, depending on who's talking. Most people settle for washing hands, face, and any part of their body that currently itches. And yet, despite all this, Parisians survive, even thrive. Their noses adapt. Their instincts sharpen. Their sense of humour becomes essential. In medieval Paris, hygiene isn't a luxury. It's a daily negotiation with fate. Medieval Paris may sparkle with markets, students, craftsmen, and tavern lights. But underneath all that noisy charm sits a truth everyone knows. The city is a playground for trouble. Crime isn't an exception. It's a daily feature, like bread, gossip, or suspicious smells drifting from unknown sources. Walking through Paris means accepting that at any moment someone might be planning to steal your purse, your chicken, or your dignity. Thieves are everywhere. Skilled pickpockets roam busy streets, slipping hands into pouches with the delicacy of a court musician plucking a lute. They target travellers, drunk students, and anyone foolish enough to look at the cathedral instead of watching their pockets. If you confront a thief, expect them to vanish into an alleyway so narrow even air struggles to pass through it. Then there are the burglars, the night workers. They prefer roofs, chimneys, unlocked shutters, and the kind of darkness only medieval cities can produce. Some call them criminals, others call them ambitious. In truth, they're just part of the ecosystem, like fishmongers or stray dogs, but slightly more motivated. The city has patrols, of course. The watchmen march through the streets with lanterns, wooden staves, and the unwavering confidence of men who know most criminals run faster than they do. Their job is simple in theory: keep the peace. In practice, peace is kept by shouting warnings, breaking up tavern fights, and strongly suggesting people go home. Their nightly chant, "The hour and the watch," echoes through the dark, reminding everyone that law and order technically exist, even if they're more decorative than effective. Justice, when it happens, is dramatic. Punishments are public, because nothing teaches morality like watching someone else's bad decisions become tomorrow's town gossip. Thieves might be whipped, pilloried, or march through the streets wearing signs explaining their crimes. More serious offences lead to less enjoyable outcomes, usually involving executioners who take their craft uncomfortably seriously. But crime isn't solely committed by villains. Sometimes it's committed by hungry citizens stealing bread, desperate families taking firewood, or university students borrowing wine they fully intend to return never. The line between criminal and victim is thin, thinner than the walls of the average Parisian home. Despite everything, the city functions. People adapt. Some grow sharper, some grow quicker. Some simply pray harder, and every sunrise proves the same thing. Medieval Paris survives its chaos with remarkable enthusiasm. In this city, law and order exist, just not necessarily in that order. For all its filth, noise, and suspiciously mobile rats, medieval Paris knows how to celebrate. When festivals arrive, the city transforms from a chaotic hive of daily survival into a swirling carnival of sound, colour, and questionable decision-making. It's the one time of year when Parisians forget the gutter, the taxes, the thieves, and the fact that their shoes have never once been dry. Religious feast days dominate the calendar, and Paris takes them very seriously, mostly because they provide excuses for eating, drinking, and temporarily ignoring responsibilities. Bells ring so loudly you feel them in your bones. Parades march through the streets, carrying saints' statues so heavy they require half the neighbourhood to lift. Priests chant, children run underfoot, dogs bark at everything. The air buzzes with incense, roasting meat, and the unmistakable scent of too many people standing too close together. The Feast of Fools is the city's favourite annual chaos generator. For one glorious day, the world turns upside down. A mock king is elected, usually someone extremely unqualified, like a drunk mason or a student with a talent for shouting. People wear masks, dance wildly, and play pranks with suspicious enthusiasm. It's the closest the medieval world comes to comedy night. Tournaments and fairs bring thrills of their own. Knights in glittering armour clash in jousts that draw massive crowds, though most spectators secretly hope for dramatic wipeouts rather than graceful displays of skill. Vendors sell everything from roasted nuts to miracle cures that definitely won't cure anything but might taste interesting. Jugglers, acrobats and musicians perform in the streets, turning Paris into a medieval talent show. And always, there is music. Flutes, drums, fiddles and voices merge into a soundtrack that weaves through the city like a living thing. Even the grumpiest baker or the sternest guildmaster finds themselves tapping a foot or humming along. Faith anchors it all. Grand churches fill with worshippers seeking forgiveness, guidance, or simply a warm place to sit. Notre Dame's soaring arches echo with hymns that briefly drown out the city's chaos. People pray for health, good harvests, protection from plague, and occasionally for their neighbours to stop throwing household waste out the window. Festivals reveal a truth often hidden beneath Paris's grime and noise. The city is alive not just in body, but in spirit. Joy, faith, and celebration pulse through it, reminding everyone, rich or poor, that life in medieval Paris may be rough, but it is undeniably full. And with that, the streets fall quiet, until dawn wakes them again. Cesare Borgia did not enter the world quietly. He was born in 1475 in Rome, right into the epicenter of one of Europe's most infamous power families, the Borgias. Even as an infant, he was wrapped not in innocence, but in politics, ambition, and a level of scandal that would make most noble families faint. His father, Rodrigo Borgia, was a cardinal of the church. His mother, Vanozza dei Catane, was very much not his wife. That alone set the tone for Cesare's entire life. Brilliant beginnings, morally flexible foundations, and a future carved through bold defiance of all expectations. The Borgias were Spanish outsiders in Italy, a fact that grated every aristocratic ego in Rome. But Rodrigo, Cesare's father, compensated with charm, money, strategy, and the type of political maneuvering that could intimidate a fox. To Rodrigo, children were assets, and Cesare, with his intelligence, charisma, and striking presence, was the most valuable of all. From childhood, Cesare was groomed for power, whether he liked it or not. Rodrigo ensured he received the best education money could buy: Latin, philosophy, law, diplomacy, military theory. Tutors described him as fiercely intelligent, frighteningly calm, and unnervingly self-assured. Even as a boy, Cesare read people with precision and carried himself with a confidence that suggested he knew he was destined for more than prayers and sermons. Yet the church had plans for him. Or rather, Rodrigo did. To strengthen the family's influence, Cesare was pushed relentlessly toward a religious career. It didn't matter that he lacked any spiritual calling. It didn't matter that he was naturally charismatic in the way warriors and kings are, not cardinals. He was a Borgia, and Borgias did not waste opportunities. By his teenage years, titles and benefices began piling up faster than he could recite the creed. But beneath the polished robes and churchly duties simmered a storm. Cesare's true nature gravitated toward action, risk, danger, anything but the suffocating world of clerical politics. He admired warriors, envied generals, and despised the idea of spending his life whispering prayers while others carved out real power. Everyone around him sensed it too. He wasn't meant for the altar. He was meant for the battlefield. This inner conflict between the church career forced upon him and the warrior he longed to be would soon explode into the defining transformation of his life. Cesare Borgia was born into scandal, but he was built for conquest. By the time Cesare Borgia reached his late teens, he was already drowning in ecclesiastical titles he never asked for. Bishop, archbishop, papal representative, the list kept growing like an aggressive vine. Every promotion was a victory for his father, Rodrigo Borgia, who was shaping the family into a political dynasty. But for Cesare, each new title was another bar in the gilded cage he desperately wanted to escape. Then everything changed in 1492. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, a triumph for the family, a disaster for anyone who thought the papacy was about piety, and the beginning of a new phase for Cesare. Overnight, he became the Pope's son, a concept that horrified moralists and delighted those who understood how power really worked. With his father on the throne of St. Peter, Cesare's future was no longer a matter of spiritual duty. It was a weapon waiting to be unleashed. But the price of this new proximity to power was steep. To secure political alliances and strengthen the Borgia influence, Rodrigo forced Cesare into the College of Cardinals at just 18. While most young men his age were drinking, dueling, or trying to impress girls, Cesare was wearing scarlet robes and sitting in a room full of elderly churchmen, pretending not to notice how absurd the situation was. Cesare accepted the title with a calm face, but the resentment was volcanic. He performed his duties flawlessly, attended councils, issued decrees, and even participated in diplomatic missions. But behind every well-rehearsed gesture, there was a young man who despised the role he played. Every sermon felt like a performance. Every prayer felt like a delay. Every meeting with scheming cardinals reminded him that his talents were being wasted on a stage he never wanted. Those who knew him well noticed his stare. Sharp, calculating, restless. Cesare wasn't built to bless people. He was built to command armies. Even the Roman elite whispered that he didn't belong in the church. Too magnetic, too ambitious, too dangerous. And they were right. Cesare's presence in the College of Cardinals was like placing a tiger on a velvet cushion, elegant in appearance, but fundamentally wrong. Still, he waited, because Cesare understood one thing better than anyone. Power was a game of timing, and the moment to shed his red robes and become who he truly was would come. And when it did, Italy would feel the impact. Cesare Borgia's transformation from reluctant cardinal to unstoppable warlord didn't happen gradually. It detonated. By the mid-1490s, the political landscape of Italy was shifting like a fault line preparing for an earthquake. The French king, Charles VIII, invaded the peninsula, sending shockwaves through every duchy, republic, and noble household. Where others panicked, Cesare saw opportunity. He had been waiting years, trapped in scarlet robes, pretending to be the churchman he never wanted to become. The invasion created cracks in the political order, and Cesare recognized them instantly. Every collapsing alliance, every frightened noble, every shifting loyalty was a chance for him to break free. The final catalyst arrived in 1498. Cesare did something almost unthinkable for a cardinal. He resigned. Officially, he requested release from his vows. Unofficially, he kicked down the door of his destiny. Pope Alexander VI granted the request, not because he thought it was holy, but because he understood the raw potential his son possessed. Cesare would be wasted behind an altar, but on the battlefield, he could build an empire, and he intended to. To transition from cardinal to commander, Cesare needed legitimacy. He found it through a politically brilliant marriage alliance. The French king, now Louis XII, agreed to support Cesare in exchange for papal approval of his own marital situation. It was a beautifully shameless trade, very Borgia in spirit. With French blessing secured, Cesare became Duke of Valentinois, adopting the name the world soon learned to fear. Il Valentino. Then came the transformation. Cesare discarded church garments and embraced armour like he had been waiting his entire life. He trained with soldiers, studied battle tactics, recruited mercenaries, and built a personal force loyal not to the church, not to Rome, but to him alone. His charisma drew men in. His ruthlessness ensured they stayed in line. Observers were stunned by how quickly the shift happened. One year, he was a cardinal gliding through ceremonies. The next, he was a warrior leading troops into danger without hesitation. This wasn't reinvention. It was revelation. The real Cesare had finally emerged. Italy watched with a mixture of fascination and terror. A former cardinal had become a rising warlord, and everyone knew what that meant. Cesare Borgia was about to carve his own state out of the fractured heart of Italy, and no one was safe. Once free from his cardinal's robes, Cesare Borgia wasted no time acting on his true ambitions. With papal backing and French military support, he set his sights on the Romagna, a patchwork of semi-independent cities in central Italy, ruled by petty tyrants, mercenaries, and aging nobles who still thought power was inherited rather than seized. Cesare had no such delusions. The campaign began in 1499, and it wasn't just about conquest, it was about message. Cesare wasn't marching like a feudal lord claiming tribute. He advanced like a modern strategist, combining diplomacy, intimidation, and sheer violence to dismantle decades of entrenched rule. One by one, cities like Imola, Forlì, Faenza, and Rimini fell under his banner. Not because he had the largest army, but because he had the sharpest mind and the coldest will. He used fear like currency. When lords resisted, he made examples of them. When cities surrendered, he offered them a better deal. Stability under his rule, enforced by soldiers who obeyed orders with terrifying efficiency. His military style was fast, professional, and calculated. No unnecessary cruelty, but no mercy for disobedience. But Cesare wasn't just conquering land. He was creating a state. He didn't loot. He organized. He installed governors, reformed taxes, and demanded order. Where chaos once reigned, he imposed structure. Even his enemies admitted the Romagna was safer under him than it had been in decades. Still, his control was built on tension. Cesare's enemies weren't just on the battlefield. They were in every corridor of power, especially the Vatican. Nobles feared him. Cardinals despised him. The Orsini and Colonna families, Rome's mafia in robes, plotted against him constantly. But Cesare didn't flinch. He moved through alliances and betrayals like a man walking through smoke, unaffected, always calculating his next move. Perhaps the most shocking part of his campaign was how modern it felt. He used spies, propaganda, forged letters, and even psychological warfare. He didn't just fight battles, he preempted them. By 1501, Cesare had turned a fragmented wasteland into a functioning principality. He was no longer just the Pope's son. He was Il Valentino, Duke of the Romagna, master of his own carved-out kingdom. But Italy was still watching, and many weren't clapping. They were sharpening their knives. Because Cesare Borgia had created something dangerous, a central Italy ruled not by tradition or title, but by will. His will. Conquering territory was one thing, keeping it was another. Cesare Borgia understood that ruling Italy required more than swords and banners. It required absolute loyalty. And since absolute loyalty didn't exist in Renaissance politics, he created it through fear, brilliance, charm, and when necessary, removal. Cesare's power rested on three pillars: his army, his spies, and his ability to predict betrayal before it happened. He learned quickly that Italian mercenaries were as loyal as cats, affectionate at dinner, murderous by morning. So he hired the best and watched them closely. His commanders included hardened captains like Ramiro de Lorqua, Michelotto Corella, and the infamous condottiero Vitellozzo Vitelli. But Cesare never forgot the key rule of Renaissance warfare: mercenaries smile right before stabbing you. To protect himself, he built a spy network that rivaled princely courts. Letters were intercepted, messengers paid off, and whispers from taverns found their way to Cesare's ears within hours. He rewarded informants generously, and punished traitors with theatrical precision. His reputation grew. Cesare does not forgive betrayal. Cesare anticipates it. The Romagna's nobles hated him for this. They resented his reforms, feared his discipline, and loathed the idea of a Borgia ruling over them. So they conspired, constantly, stupidly, and often with the same energy as people who had not been paying attention. In 1502, several of these lords formed the Magione conspiracy, believing Cesare was too distracted to notice. He noticed. At first, he played along, pretending diplomacy, offering smiles and handshakes while quietly preparing their downfall. Cesare understood that killing a conspiracy too early only creates new conspirators. Instead, he let the traitors gather confidence, then cornered them with military force and political sleight of hand. What followed became legendary. Cesare invited several conspirators to a peace meeting in Senegalia. They accepted, believing they had trapped him. Instead, Cesare arrived calm, unarmed, and smiling, a bad sign for anyone in his presence. One by one, he greeted them and had them arrested on the spot. Some were executed immediately. Others were strangled later by Michelotto, Cesare's cold-blooded enforcer whose loyalty was unquestioned and unsettling. The message was crystal clear. Cesare Borgia did not merely punish treason, he orchestrated it, exposed it, and destroyed it in ways that made future betrayal feel suicidal. By the early 1500s, Cesare had become something rare in Italy, a ruler feared, respected, and obeyed. But every force of nature, no matter how strong, eventually meets a storm. Cesare Borgia's rise cannot be understood without his partnership with the one man as ambitious as he was, his father, Pope Alexander VI. Together, they formed one of the most formidable and feared power duos in Renaissance history. Rome had seen ruthless popes, but never a father-son tandem reshaping Italy like pieces on a chessboard. Alexander provided legitimacy, money, and political authority. Cesare provided strategy, muscle, and a charisma so sharp it bordered on weaponized charm. Their relationship was not tender, but efficient. Two brilliant minds operating with a shared goal: to build a Borgia dynasty in an Italy fractured by petty rulers and endless wars. While other popes hid behind ceremony, Alexander acted like a secular monarch. He granted Cesare cardinalships, dukedoms, lands, and armies. He used papal excommunications like tactical bombs, removing enemies from God's favour whenever politically convenient. Every papal bull he signed was another step in Cesare's expansion, and Cesare, in return, turned Rome into a command centre. He installed captains throughout the Romagna, enforced order with terrifying efficiency, and sent reports to his father that read more like military communiques than spiritual updates. Together, they raised money through taxes, alliances, marriages, bribes, and occasionally, creative adjustments to church finances. Their enemies called them corrupt, immoral, unholy. Their allies called them geniuses. Cesare called them obstacles or assets. Nothing in between. The Roman elite trembled. Cardinals watched their words. Noble families like the Orsini and Colonna plotted but hesitated, knowing Cesare's spies operated even inside their palaces. Diplomats from France, Spain, and Venice observed this father-son engine with fascination. No one had ever seen a papal household function like a military headquarters. Yet for all their power, tensions simmered. Cesare was growing independent. He wanted to rule as a prince, not as a papal instrument. He pushed for more land, more autonomy, more personal authority. Alexander, proud but wary, understood that Cesare's ambition was a wildfire, useful for burning enemies, dangerous when uncontrolled. But neither father nor son anticipated the fragile foundation beneath their empire. Their power depended heavily on Alexander's life. As long as he lived, Cesare's state-building machine had unstoppable momentum. Every conquest, every alliance, every political miracle Cesare achieved depended on one thing: the Pope must not die. And in Renaissance Italy, that was never guaranteed. In 1503, Cesare Borgia stood at the peak of his power. His armies controlled the Romagna. His enemies were dead, scattered, or pretending to be his friends. His reforms were reshaping central Italy into a functioning state. He was feared, admired, and studied, even by Niccolò Machiavelli, who observed him closely and took notes like a man watching a living blueprint for political dominance. And then it happened, the one event that could shatter everything. Pope Alexander VI, Cesare's father, fell violently ill in August 1503. Rome whispered rumours immediately: poison, malaria, bad wine, divine punishment. The truth remains debated, but the outcome was unmistakable. Within days, the powerful pope was dying, and with him, the foundation of the entire Borgia Empire. Cesare rushed to his father's side, but he was sick as well, struck by the same fever. Some believed they had both been poisoned. Others suspected the summer air around the Vatican was drenched with disease. Regardless of the cause, Cesare was bedridden, barely able to stand, while the most crucial political moment of his life unfolded. On August 18th, Pope Alexander VI died. For most of Italy, this was liberation. For Cesare, it was disaster. The Pope had been his shield, his engine, his legitimizer. Without Alexander, Cesare's authority evaporated like smoke in the August heat. Rome erupted into chaos. Cardinals scrambled to undo Borgia influence. Rival families armed themselves. Exiled enemies emerged from shadows like wolves sensing a wounded lion. Cesare, still weak from illness, could barely lift a sword, let alone defend his hard-won territories. His enemies knew it. The Orsini, the Colonna, Venice, Florence, everyone who had ever feared him suddenly found courage. To make matters worse, a conclave was forming. The next pope would either solidify Cesare's legacy or destroy everything he built. Cesare, staggering and fevered, tried to influence the vote, still fighting with the stubborn will of a man refusing to accept fate. But illness forced him to withdraw from Rome at the worst possible moment. The Borgias had spent years bending the papacy to their will. Now it slipped out of their hands in a matter of hours. Alexander's death didn't just weaken Cesare, it decapitated his entire empire. And the vultures were already circling overhead. Cesare had built his state on brilliance, violence, and charisma. But even he could not outmaneuver death itself. With Alexander VI dead, and Cesare still half-crippled by fever, the vultures of Italy didn't just circle, they dove. Overnight, Cesare went from the most feared warlord in central Italy to a man standing on collapsing ground. His enemies didn't wait for him to recover. They moved fast, each one eager to tear away a piece of his hard-won dominion. The first blow came from the College of Cardinals. The same men who once bowed to him now pretended they had never heard the name Borgia. The conclave to elect a new pope became a battlefield, with every faction scheming to ensure Cesare's destruction. He poured what strength he had into backing Cardinal Piccolomini, who briefly became Pope Pius III, and briefly is generous. Pius reigned for less than a month, dying before he had the chance to secure Cesare's future. Then came the next conclave. Cesare backed Giuliano della Rovere, not because they were friends, they hated each other, but because della Rovere had promised safety. Cesare gambled on necessity, and della Rovere was elected as Pope Julius II. The moment he secured the throne, he honoured their agreement for exactly 5 minutes. Then he turned on Cesare with biblical enthusiasm. Cesare was stripped of titles. His officials were removed. His territories were declared returned to the Holy See. Julius unleashed every political and military enemy Cesare had ever humiliated. The Romagna, once united under his rule, splintered overnight as towns defected, mercenary captains swapped sides, and rival families re-emerged like mould in a damp cellar. Cesare, still weakened, tried to salvage what he could. He negotiated. He threatened. He wrote letters with the intensity of a drowning man punching through waves. But every day brought new betrayals. Former allies distanced themselves. Soldiers defected for better pay. Nobles proclaimed loyalty to the church, a polite way of saying, we prefer living. Rome itself became hostile territory. The Orsini and Colonna families, who spent years fantasizing about Borgia downfall, now hunted Cesare with open glee. Streets he once ruled with ease became corridors of danger. Finally, Julius II played his final card. Cesare was arrested. Publicly, It was for the sake of order. Privately, the message was clear. The Borgia era was being erased. Cesare Borgia, the man who once reshaped Italy by sheer force of will, now found himself betrayed, cornered, and stripped of everything. And yet, his story wasn't finished. A wounded lion is still a lion. Cesare Borgia's final chapter did not unfold in Rome, nor in the fortified cities he once ruled with iron precision. It unfolded far from Italy, across mountains and foreign courts, where a fallen prince clawed desperately for one last chance at destiny. Even stripped of titles, lands, and an empire, Cesare refused to fade quietly. His ambition, like a flame denied oxygen, burned hotter in its final moments. After Pope Julius II imprisoned him, Cesare was sent to Spain, a political gift to King Ferdinand of Aragon, who had never trusted the Borgias. In prison, Cesare paced like a caged predator, his mind dissecting every defeat, every betrayal. But captivity could not kill his instincts. He waited, studied guards, memorized routines, and calculated risks the way other men recited prayers. In 1506, he escaped. It was pure Borgia audacity, a daring nighttime breakout involving bribed guards, forged letters, and the relentless will of a man who refused to die behind walls. Cesare fled across Spain disguised as a servant, riding through storms, deserts, and roads crawling with soldiers searching for him. Every mile carried the echo of his former empire, now lost, now unreachable. But he wasn't running. He was repositioning. Cesare sought refuge in Navarre, a small kingdom between France and Spain. King John of Albret, his brother-in-law, welcomed him not as a criminal, but as a seasoned commander. Cesare, ever the strategist, saw a path to rebuild his power, serve Navarre, win victories, gather troops, and eventually carve out a new domain. His dream wasn't dead, merely wounded. In 1507, while leading a military campaign for Navarre, Cesare faced his final battle near the town of Viana. It was a small conflict compared to the grand campaigns of Italy, but fate rarely cares about scale. Cesare, scouting ahead with only a handful of men, found himself surrounded by enemy forces. He could have retreated. He could have waited for reinforcements. He didn't. The man who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince charged alone, cutting through soldiers with reckless brilliance. For a moment, the battlefield trembled with echoes of the conqueror he once was. But numbers triumphed where kingdoms had failed. Cesare fell beneath a storm of lances and blades, fighting to the last breath, refusing surrender even as death closed in. He was 31. Buried beneath the open sky he had tried to rule, Cesare Borgia died as he lived, fearless, defiant, and unforgettable, and history, mesmerized by his flame, never let his name go. The story of the Varangian Guard begins not in Byzantium, but in the cold, thunderous world of the north, a land of fjords, longships, and warriors raised on sagas instead of sermons. These men were not born into quiet lives. They grew up listening to the crash of waves, the howl of the wind, and the tales of ancestors who carved their names into the world through axe, oath, and courage. By the 10th century, these Norse adventurers had begun drifting eastward, following rivers that cut through dense forests and sprawling Slavic lands. They traded, raided, farmed when necessary, drank when possible, and fought always. These were the Varangians, a word that meant sworn companion, or those who commit to a vow. They served as merchants, mercenaries, and wandering swords looking for a place where their skill meant more than their birth. That place turned out to be Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, magnificent and brittle, was constantly threatened by enemies from every direction. Emperors needed bodyguards who were loyal not to plotting nobles, not to corrupt generals, but to them alone. And so the emperors looked north, toward the men the Rus princes used as elite warriors, men who fought like storms and died with a smile if gold and honor accompanied them. When the first groups of Varangians arrived in the imperial capital, Constantinople took notice. These warriors were taller than most Byzantines, broad-shouldered, pale-haired, and armed with two-handed axes capable of splitting shields, and occasionally people, in a single downward stroke. They made an impression simply by walking through a marketplace. To the emperors, they were perfect. Foreign enough to avoid local politics, loyal enough when paid well, and terrifying enough to discourage rebellions. In 988, Emperor Basil II officially formed them into a permanent unit, the Varangian Guard. For the Northmen, it was a paradise of opportunity. They traded wooden halls for marble palaces, cold rain for Mediterranean sunlight, and local chieftains for the most powerful ruler in the Christian world. Here they could earn wealth, reputation, and glory beyond anything available at home. But more importantly, they found a purpose. The Varangian Guard wasn't just a military unit. It was a brotherhood forged by oath, a place where men from distant lands bound themselves to an emperor they barely knew, and defended him with a loyalty so absolute that Byzantine chroniclers described it with awe. This is where their legend truly begins. To join the Varangian Guard was not as simple as signing a contract or collecting a uniform. It was a transformation, a crossing from the life of an ordinary warrior into the life of an oath-bound elite. The first step was simple: swear absolute loyalty to the Emperor of Byzantium. No tribe, no chieftain, no homeland came before that promise. This oath wasn't poetic. It was blunt, ironclad, and enforced with consequences no one wanted to test. A Varangian vowed to protect the Emperor's body with his own, to fight his enemies without hesitation, and to obey his commands even when those commands led directly into danger. In a world where alliances shifted like sand in the wind, this kind of loyalty was almost unnatural, which is exactly why the Byzantines valued it. Once sworn in, a Varangian didn't just join a military unit. He joined a brotherhood of foreigners bound together by shared danger, shared purpose, and shared exile. Many came from Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, but others, later in the Guard's history, came from Anglo-Saxon England after the Norman conquest. These men brought with them accents, scars, and grievances that blended into a single identity: Varangian. Inside the empire, the oath acted like armour. The Byzantines trusted the Guard precisely because they weren't tied to local politics. Court factions, rival generals, and ambitious nobles couldn't buy their loyalty or manipulate them with promises of future power. Varangians didn't want titles. They wanted gold, and they wanted to earn it with their axes. Payment followed victory. The Guard received salaries, spoils, and bonuses from imperial coffers, and during coronations they even had the traditional right to pillage the palace. Respectfully, of course. For men who had grown up in rugged northern landscapes, the wealth of Constantinople was intoxicating. Many returned home years later as gold men, wealthy enough to buy estates or build their own halls. Yet the oath was not just a formality. It was sacred. Betraying the emperor meant betraying your oath brothers. Varangians had a reputation for fighting to the last man rather than abandoning their sworn duty. Chroniclers described them forming shield walls in palace corridors, at city gates, or even around emperors who had already fallen, because the oath did not end with death. In a world of political treachery, the Varangian Guard's loyalty was a fortress made of iron, oath, and axe. The Varangian Guard earned their reputation not through ceremony or prestige, but through the simple fact that they were terrifying in battle. Their weapon of choice, the massive two-handed Danish axe, was not subtle. It was not decorative. It was not polite. It was a tool designed to break formations, split shields, and turn armoured knights into unpleasant historical footnotes. The Byzantines had never seen anything like it. Most imperial soldiers carried spears, swords, or bows. Effective, disciplined, elegant. But when the Varangians arrived, they brought the northern philosophy of war. Hit the enemy so hard that his grandchildren feel it. The axes they wielded were nearly as tall as the men carrying them, blades wide enough to bite through helmets, shafts sturdy enough to absorb the shock of smashing into steel or bone. In the hands of an ordinary soldier, the weapon was impractical. In the hands of a Varangian, it became a force of nature. Their fighting style was unlike anything in the Mediterranean. Where Byzantines preferred formations and tactics, Varangians fought with controlled fury. Not berserk rage. That was for amateurs. The Guard was trained to channel northern aggression with Byzantine discipline. They fought in coordinated lines, unleashing devastating downward strikes that shattered shields and sent entire ranks backward. Enemies learned very quickly. Do not stand in front of a Varangian charge. Do not stand behind it either. But it wasn't just the axes. Varangians also carried swords, shields, and occasionally spears. Their armour combined Byzantine craftsmanship with northern toughness. Chainmail over padded gambesons, helmets reinforced with nasal guards, cloaks wrapped tight to shield against wind and arrows. The mix gave them durability without sacrificing mobility. Training was relentless. New recruits drilled daily in the palace barracks, learning Byzantine formations and battle protocols. Veterans taught them how to swing the great axe efficiently, how to rotate their shoulders to generate maximum force, and how to keep balance during chaotic clashes. Mistakes were corrected with bruises. Lessons were written in sweat. By the time a warrior completed training, he wasn't just a foreigner with a big axe. He was a polished weapon, a hybrid of Viking ferocity and Byzantine precision. This combination made the Varangian Guard the emperor's shock troops. When a battle began to fail, when enemy lines needed to be broken, when the empire's fate hung by a thread, the emperor would give a single order: send in the Varangians, and the enemy would pray. Serving in the Varangian Guard didn't just mean fighting battles. It meant living inside the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, the great palace of Constantinople, and becoming part of its sacred rituals. Here, the Guard wasn't merely a military unit. It was the emperor's living wall, a barrier of oath-bound giants standing between the ruler and the chaos of the outside world. Each day began with ceremony. Varangians lined palace corridors, helmets gleaming, axes resting upright like symbols of divine authority. Whenever the emperor moved, the Guard formed a protective corridor around him. Byzantine courtiers described the sight with a mix of awe and fear. Towering foreigners with fair hair, pale eyes, and broad shoulders, dressed in polished mail and carrying axes that looked far too large to be purely ceremonial. The message was clear. To reach the emperor, you must first get past them. Their presence became essential to imperial ritual. During coronations, the Varangians guarded the Hagia Sophia and escorted the emperor to the throne, their axes raised in salute. At imperial banquets, they stood behind the ruler's seat like immovable statues, watching the room with the calm suspicion of men who had seen far too many poisoning attempts. This wasn't paranoia, it was tradition. The Varangians also served during diplomatic receptions, acting as visual proof that the emperor commanded the loyalty of the fiercest warriors on earth. Ambassadors from Europe, Arabia, and Asia often wrote about their sheer size and intimidating silence. One Western visitor famously observed that the Varangians stood like carved pillars, each one able to cut a man in two, should the emperor desire it. But palace service wasn't all ceremony. It demanded discipline. Varangians rotated guard shifts, maintained strict cleanliness standards, and kept their weapons polished to mirror shine. Their barracks were within the palace complex itself, giving them immediate access to the emperor at any hour. This proximity formed a unique bond. While other soldiers served commanders, the Varangians served the man. Their loyalty was personal, not political, a rare thing in the Byzantine world where intrigue was a national sport. And yet, even here, their northern roots showed. They carved their names into palace walls, especially in the upper galleries of Hagia Sophia, leaving runic graffiti declaring, "Thorvald was here." Halfdan carved these runes. These marks still survive today, proof that beneath the ceremonial armour and imperial obedience, the Varangians never stopped being Northmen. A brotherhood, a wall of steel, a tradition carved in stone and oath. When the Varangian Guard marched into battle, the mood of the entire Byzantine army changed. Soldiers who moments earlier doubted the outcome suddenly stood taller. Enemies who had been confident now hesitated. Everyone knew what it meant when the tall, axe-bearing foreigners moved to the front lines. The emperor had decided that the situation required unstoppable force. The guard served as shock troops, the decisive weapon unleashed when subtlety and strategy had failed. Their role was simple and brutal: break the enemy's line, turn chaos into opportunity, and shatter morale with sheer physical dominance. And they excelled at it. Their greatest battlefield asset was discipline. Popular imagination paints them as berserkers, wild-eyed northerners screaming into the fray. The truth was far more dangerous. The Varangians fought with cold precision. They advanced in tight ranks, shields interlocked, axes raised, but controlled. Their voices did not erupt into chaotic war cries. They erupted into unified shouts that rolled across the battlefield like thunder. Then came the strike. A Varangian axe blow was not a casual swing. It was a calculated, practiced movement using both body weight and momentum. Shields split, spears snapped, armour buckled. Mounted knights, the pride of Western armies, often found their horses hamstrung or their helmets crushed before they even understood what hit them. One Byzantine chronicler described a Varangian charge as a wall of iron that moves like a storm. Another wrote that when the Varangians reached enemy lines, the battle was no longer a contest, but a killing. Their most famous engagement came during the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a disastrous day for Byzantine forces. While the rest of the army collapsed under Seljuk attack and treachery, the Varangians refused to flee. They fought around Emperor Romanos Diogenes, forming a ring of steel to protect him. Even as units deserted, even as allies betrayed their emperor mid-battle, the Varangians held the line until they were almost entirely wiped out. Their loyalty was suicidal, their discipline unwavering, their courage legendary. But the Guard was not just a defensive force. On imperial campaigns in Italy, Syria, the Balkans, and Anatolia, they served as the spearhead, the unit chosen to break fortifications and storm city gates. Enemies often surrendered at the mere sight of their banners, preferring negotiation to confrontation. Victory followed their footsteps. Fear preceded them. To face a Varangian was to face the Empire's wrath embodied in flesh, steel, and oath. Away from the battlefield and palace corridors, the Varangian Guard lived by traditions older than Byzantium itself. These warriors may have sworn loyalty to an emperor, worn Byzantine armour, and marched under imperial banners. But in their hearts, they never stopped being Northmen. Their culture travelled with them, alive in every feast, song, and oath shared among their brothers. Feasting was central to their identity. When the Guard returned from campaign, bloodied, victorious, and usually richer, the celebrations were legendary. They drank from great curved horns decorated with silver, carved patterns, and sometimes runes. The Byzantines drank wine delicately from goblets. The Varangians drank like men trying to outdo the gods. Their drink of choice? Mead, if they could find it. Wine, if they had to. Anything strong, if neither was available. During these feasts, the hall roared with laughter, clashing cups, and stories exaggerated so dramatically that even Odin would have raised an eyebrow. Veterans recounted battles where they single-handedly took on 50 men. Recruits listened wide-eyed, wondering if this was bravery or drunken fiction. Probably both. Music followed. Some Varangians carried lyres or flutes from home. Others improvised with whatever they found. Songs celebrated fallen comrades, glorious victories, and occasionally mocked Byzantine courtiers. Privately, of course. Brotherhood mattered above all. The Guard was a family forged by exile and oath, and their feasts were the glue that kept that family whole. Their traditions weren't only about joy. They honoured the dead with rituals rooted in northern belief. When a Varangian fell, his brothers ensured he was remembered not with tears, but with pride. They carved runes in hidden corners of Hagia Sophia, marking names and memories in stone. A silent reminder that even in a foreign empire, the North still spoke. The Byzantines found these customs fascinating, strange, and occasionally alarming. Palace staff whispered about the wild northern feasts that took place behind barracks walls. Some wrote admiringly about the guards' loyalty to each other. Others noted, slightly nervously, that a drunk Varangian was still more dangerous than a sober palace guard. Yet despite the cultural differences, the empire respected their unity. Their traditions gave them strength, a sense of identity untouched by politics or intrigue. For the Varangians, a feast was more than food and drink. It was a reminder of who they were. Exiles, brothers, warriors, bound by oath, strengthened by firelight, and made immortal by memory. For all their ferocity and all their feasting, one of the most remarkable traditions of the Varangian Guard is found not on the battlefield, nor in the palace halls, but carved quietly, defiantly, into the stone walls of the greatest church in the Byzantine world, Hagia Sophia. To the Byzantines, Hagia Sophia was the heart of the empire, the meeting point of heaven and earth. Its vast domes, glittering mosaics, and soaring arches symbolized the power of God and emperor alike. To the Varangians, it was awe-inspiring, but also unfamiliar. They had grown up with wooden stave churches, open-sky rituals, and the lingering memory of the old gods. Here, they found themselves standing guard inside a sacred jewel of marble and gold, far from home yet bound by oath to protect what lay within, and so they left their mark. Literally. More than once, Varangians carved runes into the marble railings of the upper galleries. These inscriptions, still visible today, read like quiet declarations across time. Arni was here. Halfdan carved these runes. Nothing poetic, nothing elaborate, just names carved by men who wanted the world, or the distant future, to know. I lived, I served, I stood in this place. It was a tradition that blended identity with duty. While their armour glinted in the candlelight of the great church, the Varangians listened to Byzantine hymns they barely understood. They watched ceremonies that felt theatrical, grand, and impossibly foreign. Yet they stood with absolute loyalty, guarding the emperor during coronations, holy processions, and public appearances. Carving runes wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. A way for a man to root himself in a world that wasn't his. A way to bridge the icy rivers of Scandinavia with the warmth of Constantinople. A way to say, I may serve far from home, but I have not forgotten who I am. This blend of cultures made the Guard unique. They embraced Christianity. Many fought wearing small crosses beneath their armour, but they also held on to the symbols of their ancestors. They swore Byzantine oaths in Greek, yet told sagas in Old Norse. They guarded the empire's holiest site with discipline so strict it became legendary, yet scratched runes into its marble like bored Vikings stuck in church. Byzantine chroniclers learned to appreciate this strange duality. They wrote of the Varangians as loyal unto death, men whose faithfulness to the emperor surpassed the devotion of many born within the empire. And the runes remain, silent, stubborn, carved proof that the north once lived inside Byzantium's sacred heart. The Byzantine Empire produced intrigue the way volcanoes produce ash, constantly, violently, and without warning. Palace coups, riots, plots, poisonings, and midnight betrayals were part of the political climate. And whenever the storm broke, one question decided the fate of emperors. Where do the Varangians stand? Unlike Byzantine generals, who shifted loyalties like the wind, the Varangian Guard held fast to their oath. They were not politicians. They were not nobles. They had no dynastic ambitions. Their loyalty was simple, rigid, and terrifyingly reliable. Protect the emperor until death, his or theirs. This made them the empire's final defense during crises. When an emperor faced rebellion, the Varangians formed a wall between him and the assassins. When mobs stormed the palace, they sealed the gates and fought in narrow corridors where their axes were most deadly. When a usurper tried to seize power, the success of the coup often depended entirely on whether he could bribe or intimidate the guard, and the answer was almost always no. One of the most dramatic examples came during the riots of 1042, when Emperor Michael V was overthrown. The mob howled outside the palace, demanding his blood. The Varangians defended him with ferocity, holding back thousands. Even when Michael's rule collapsed, they did not abandon their oath. They organized a last stand, escorting him through hidden passages and protecting him until the very moment he surrendered. Another legendary moment came during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. As crusaders breached Constantinople's walls, chaos consumed the city. While Byzantine units fled or defected, the Varangians didn't hesitate. They fought in burning streets, along the sea walls, and inside the palace itself. Chroniclers describe them cleaving through armoured crusaders with such violence that even seasoned knights recoiled. But loyalty had limits, not moral ones, but practical ones. The guard was sworn to the emperor, not the empire. When a ruler was officially deposed or declared illegitimate by the court, the oath ended. This could change everything in an instant. One night, an emperor had a wall of axe-bearing giants at his back. The next morning he had nothing at all. Still, their final duty remained constant: escort the fallen emperor to exile, monastery, or execution with stoic discipline. They were the only Byzantine soldiers trusted to guard both a ruler in power and a ruler in disgrace. When the palace burned, when treachery reigned, when Byzantium devoured itself, the Varangians stood firm. Steel in the fire, oath in the darkness. For all their loyalty, terror, and iron discipline, every Varangian warrior served with one dream in mind: to go home rich enough to live like a king. The Byzantine emperors understood this perfectly. They paid the guard in gold, silver, land grants, and a special privilege unmatched anywhere else in medieval Europe: the right to pillage the palace during coronations. This wasn't an act of vandalism, it was tradition. When a new emperor was crowned, the Varangians were allowed to take whatever valuables they could carry from the imperial treasury. Respectfully, of course. Chests, jewellery, coins, silk, icons, even furniture if they were feeling ambitious. It was both a reward and a reminder. These men guard the emperor. The emperor rewards their guardianship. And when a Varangian had earned enough, he had two choices. Freedom through fortune-won path was simple: retire. A man who returned to Norway, Sweden, or Iceland with Byzantine gold was no mere soldier. He was a wealthy man, capable of buying land, building a hall, or even entering politics. Many who returned were transformed from second sons with no inheritance into respected chieftains. Some became traders, some married well, some built farms that dominated their regions. Others became saga-worthy local legends, their stories blending seamlessly with myth. Freedom through death. The second path, darker and more honoured, was to die in service. Many Varangians fell in battles across Italy, Anatolia, the Balkans, and even in the burning streets of Constantinople. Their brothers ensured they were remembered, through feasts, carvings, runes on marble, and stories retold for decades. For them, the oath ended only when the axe fell from their hands. The slow fade of a legend. The guard continued for centuries, evolving as Scandinavians were gradually replaced by Anglo-Saxons fleeing Norman rule. Yet the heart of the tradition stayed the same: loyalty, discipline, and the axe. But even legends end. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Byzantium was no longer the empire it once had been. Wealth dwindled, borders shrank, and enemies multiplied. The Varangians remained loyal, but the world around them changed. Their last recorded appearance comes during the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when a final handful held the sea walls against Ottoman forces. They fought to the end, as they always had, and when the city fell, the era of the Varangian Guard died with it. But their legacy remains carved in marble, written in chronicles, whispered in sagas, and etched forever in the identity of two worlds: the North that birthed them, and the Empire that made them immortal. Steel, oath, brotherhood. The Varangian Guard lived by it. History remembers them for it.